When driving the Hypercar Class in Le Mans Ultimate, the brake bias and brake migration systems are a crucial tool to help alter the car's behaviour to suit your driving style. And in this video, I'll show you how to use them. So welcome to part 3 of our Le Mans Ultimate Hypercar Beginner Series, where we'll cover everything you need to know about the car's brake bias and brake migration systems. Now, if you haven't yet, I recommend that you watch our previous episode where we cover the correct braking technique so that you can develop the skills necessary to take full advantage of the lessons in this episode. So what is the brake bias system? Well, just like many other classes of race car, whenever we apply the brakes, that brake pressure is divided between the front and rear brakes. This amount isn't spread evenly, however, and we can use the brake bias system to determine how much of the brake pressure goes to the front and the rear brakes respectively. For example, if we have a brake bias of 60-40, this means that whenever we apply the brakes, 60% of that brake pressure will go to the front brakes and the remaining 40% will go to the rear brakes. Now this raises the question, well, why not just leave the brake bias at 50-50? And the simple answer is that there's particular side effects to having our brake bias set more towards the front or rear of the car that we'll explain now. So imagining that this car is our brake bias, setting the bias to the front has the following positive effects. First, we have less chance of locking up the rear brakes because there's less pressure on them, meaning less heat buildup during the braking process. Second, we get more stopping power, meaning that we can brake later because the car becomes more efficient at slowing down. And third, the car will feel more stable during the braking process, reducing the amount that the rear of the car will rotate. This, however, comes with some negative side effects. The increased pressure on the front brakes increases their chance of locking up. More brake pressure means more heat generated. This added stability during the braking also means that there is less rotation in the car, causing it to understeer more when turning in for a corner. The rate at which the front tyres wear also increases due to the added pressure and heat generated on the front brakes. Now when it comes to the rear brake bias, the effects are basically the opposite. There's less chance of the front brakes locking up due to the reduced amount of pressure and heat built up on them. The rear of the car will also rotate more during the braking process, meaning that we get more oversteer when turning into the corner, allowing us to rotate the car more efficiently, which then allows us to go back on the throttle and exit the corner sooner. Now on to the negative side effects. We have less stopping power, meaning we often need to brake earlier. The rear brakes have an increased chance of locking up due to the increase in pressure and heat built up. The increased rotation in the rear of the car can cause it to feel more unstable during braking, which increases the chance of making mistakes during cornering. And finally, the rear tyres will wear out faster due to the increased pressure and heat built up on them. So then what is the ideal brake bias? Well, the answer to this will never be the same because it's determined by you, the driver, and what feels comfortable for you. The general goal, however, is to have the brake bias as much to the rear as possible so that we get as much rotation as we can when turning in for a corner, whilst ensuring that a majority of the bias is at the front so that we don't lose too much stopping power and decrease the chance of the rear brakes locking up. So how do you find the brake bias that's right for you? Well, it's fairly simple because all you need to do is get on track and drive a few laps to form an opinion of how the car feels, and I'll show you how we do that now. In this example, we're using the Ferrari 499P at Bahrain, and we're using the default setup, which uses a brake bias of 52.3 at the front and 47.7 at the rear. Now we can change our brake bias in the car setup menu or whilst driving in the electronics section of the MFD. Remember that the first number will always be your front brake bias and the second number your rear bias. Now I'm going to show you 2 laps here, and this first one is with the default brake bias we just mentioned. So my feeling during that lap was that there was just too much understeer. I missed a few apexes when trying to carry more speed through those corners, and then when I did manage to hit them, I felt like I was slowing the car down far too much to achieve that. So in this scenario, what I did was move the brake bias backwards slightly to make it 51 at the front and 49 at the rear. Now let's take a look at the result. Now my immediate feeling during that lap was that there was a lot more rotation in the majority of corners, especially the faster ones like the S's in Sector 2. This caused me to gain time in the majority of corners, and I managed to gain over half a second over the previous lap just by moving the brake bias backwards a few clicks. And now you can do the same. Load up the Bahrain circuit and choose whatever hypercar you like, as well as any setup you want, and just drive around the track to get a feeling for what the car's braking and rotation is like. This of course is just a really basic way of manipulating the car's behavior, and a lot more advanced changes can be made in the car setup menu in order to tailor the car to your driving style. More on this in the future. But now, what is brake migration and why is it useful? Well, let's just say we're really happy with the rotation we get using the 51 to 49 brake bias, but we find that the braking can be a little unstable and we feel like the rear brakes are close to or have been locking up slightly during heavy braking. Now, it would be really useful if there was a way we could move our brake bias more to the front during the heavy braking and then move it back to where it was when we tried to turn it for the corner, wouldn't it? Well, this is exactly what the brake migration system does. Basically, it's an automated system that moves our brake bias to the front as we press down on the brake pedal, temporarily relieving some pressure from the rear brakes. It then moves the bias back to the rear as we take our foot off the brake pedal, giving us back some rotation. Now, just like our brake bias, we can adjust the brake migration in both the car setup menu as well as whilst driving the car using the electronics tab in the MFD, and we can set our brake bias from off to 2.5%. Now let's say we have our migration set to 1%. What happens is that as we press down on the brake pedal, once it's pressed down halfway, the brake bias will have changed to 51.5 at the front and 48.5 at the rear. Then once we've pressed the brake pedal down all the way, the brake bias will have changed to 52 at the front and 48 at the rear. Then as we release the brake pedal, the opposite happens, and the bias gradually moves back to 51 and 49 in the same manner. So how would we find this tool useful? Well, here's a few examples. The first, which we've mentioned briefly already, is that the migration value can be used as part of the setup of your car. If we found a brake bias value that we really like, but we find that there's too much pressure on the rear brakes during the heavy braking phases, simply increase the brake migration a few clicks until you find some of that stability at the rear come back to you. In fact, in many setups used by high-level drivers, you'll often find that the brake migration has been moved to the maximum of 2.5. This has been done in order for them to have the brake bias set as much to the rear as is comfortable to get the most rotation that they can out of the car. This does, however, come with some risk, which ties into our next examples. Say you're in a race and you've locked up your rear too many times, which has damaged your rear tyres heavily, and now during heavy braking it feels like the rear could lock up at any second. Increasing your brake migration could help relieve the pressure off of your rear tyres during braking, giving them a chance to at least cool down and get back to a usable state. In another scenario, let's say you've received some damage to your car from another driver, which has caused the car to not rotate as well anymore. Moving your brake bias back a few more clicks can give us back some rotation, and then moving the brake migration forward a few clicks can help ensure that we don't lock up the rear brakes due to moving the brake bias backwards more. And this is the risk that I mentioned earlier. You see, in both of these situations, if we're already using a full brake migration of 2.5%, then it leaves us with no fallback when things go wrong due to the fact that we can't increase our migration value anymore to the front since we're already running it at the maximum value. This is definitely a risk versus reward situation, and it's up to you to decide if you're willing to take that risk or play it safe and give yourself a fallback plan if things go wrong during a race. Well, that covers everything about the brake bias and brake migration systems in the Hypercar class. At the end of the day, it's about finding balance. When a car is well balanced, it feels easy to drive. And when a car feels easy to drive, it gives you the confidence to push the car and achieve the best results that you can. Now, if you have any other questions about what we covered today or about Le Mans Ultimate in general, then feel free to leave them in the comments section below. But thanks as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.